All right.
So welcome to Palestine 102. This is the history of the U.S. involvement past 100 years. My name is Morgan.
Hi, I'm Bonnie.
Go ahead.
We're both members of Harrisburg Palestine Coalition. Were you going to say something?
No.
No. Okay, perfect. So I just wanted to gauge really quick what sort of the knowledge base is in the room or on Zoom in terms of like the history of U.S. involvement with Israel since like World War II, for example, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being I know nothing, and 10 being I wrote a dissertation about this.
5 heading towards 6. Yeah, 5 heading towards 6 is right.
5, 6, 3, 4, 2. All right, 4. 4.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah. I like to see that. Yeah. Honestly, for a lot of what we're talking about, this is a really good, and I'll talk about it at the end, but this is a really good resource just for understanding the past 100 years from a Palestinian perspective specifically.
For those on Zoom, It's the 100 Years War on Palestine, also known as the New Bible. Okay, awesome. So, I mean, everyone who's here today understands why this is important to understand the history of the U.S. involvement with Israel. But I just wanted to sort of preface it a little bit, because one thing that I feel like I hear a lot with people that are sort of defending their complacency when it comes to global acts of atrocities or, genocide or whatever it might be, is that people are always like, what does it have to do with me? Or why should I care? I'm just here in the US, just, I don't know, going to coffee shops and hanging out. I don't know. So this teaching isn't centering that question, but it's sort of, I think will help people address it in conversation. And it definitely points to a gap in knowledge in terms of American education, what we don't learn in school and the importance of why we should learn it. So I wanted to start with this quote from the United States Department of State, which says primarily, the United States was the first country to recognize Israel as a state in 1948, and it was the first to recognize Jerusalem as the capital in 2017. Israel has no greater friend than the United States. A long-standing U.S. priority is to promote a comprehensive and lasting solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict by urging both sides to look towards the future rather than at historical narratives and grievances. So this is from 2020, so this was during the Trump presidency, and it feels like this could have been said at any point in U.S. history, essentially. And then this last sentence just felt very important because the U.S. is advocating for something that's like a quote unquote mutually beneficial agreement or stance for both parties, but they also just said that Israel's our BFF and we're looking out for their interests, but we have to ignore history in order to get there. And that just doesn't really make sense, because if we're looking to fight for a just future, justice doesn't happen in a vacuum, and justice doesn't happen when you ignore history. So it just felt like an important way to understand our country's feelings about Israel and the quote unquote Palestinian question. Okay. Oh, I went backwards. Frogs. Okay.
Oh, sorry. So there were Zionist settlements in Palestine before and after World War I, with the rise of Zionism. But for the purposes of understanding U.S. involvement specifically, we're going to start with a comparison of U.S. attitudes towards foreign policy, both before and after World War II, because that's when we see the kind of direct, my goodness, what word is that? Interference of the U.S. So before World War II, we had this kind of idea of open door trade. This was conceived as it's kind of an alternative to colonialism and imperialism. It was sort of based on this idea that the U.S.'s role in the 20th century would be that of a nation that would lead over other world powers in alignment with public morals and in pursuit of peace instead of hostility. This kind of idea was conceived by the Secretary of State in 1898. A little bit of background: there was global competition with trade or for trade with China in the late 1890s, early 1900s. The U.S. really worried that other imperial powers would sort of partition the land and just cut out American trade altogether. So the U.S. sort of believed that equal access to all of the ports would deny those sort of land grabs and ensure that all foreign powers would be able to trade equally with China and kind of reap those benefits. This was sort of enacted into what they called the open door policy. But this was an informal agreement. It wasn't a treaty. It was non-binding. It wasn't really enforceable. They kind of didn't really enforce it. But those sort of central kind of underlying principles of that equal access and peace over hostilities was kind of becoming an increasing like central component of the US's sort of broader foreign policy before World War II. The next point, we had a comparatively less militarized foreign policy. The US was pretty isolated in terms of foreign policy before and after World War I. This didn't really change until we started getting more involved with World War II. So though the US was still really heavily engaged in trade with Latin America and with helping to rebuild Europe during the 20s, the Great Depression kind of brought that general economic uncertainty that sort of led to the US kind of reinforcing that isolation in the world, especially with the brewing tension in Europe and Asia in the 30s. And that isolation pretty much lasted until the 40s. The US started providing aid to the nations that were fighting against the Axis powers, so fighting against Germany, Italy, Japan, and then eventually they joined the war. And then the last one, the American naval education foregrounds the importance of the Sinai Peninsula, had pretty much emphasized the importance of this for the future in general. The Manhattan Project.
I think you were going for the birth of the UN, maybe you're.
Was I?
Yeah.
Let me just say really quickly, the Manhattan Project completely changed the way we handle state security. Everything turned much more secretive, centralized, non-democratic. The CIA became a really big thing. We kind of just, yeah. So anyway, next, the UN was created officially in response to the atrocities and violence witnessed in World Wars I and II. This was an attempt to maintain international peace and security and to achieve cooperation among nations on economic, social, and humanitarian problems. With this, we also have the creation of the International Court of Justice, which is the ICJ, the judicial body of the UN. Their role is to oversee the legal disputes of economic and humanitarian conflicts between nation states. And then we also have the UNSC, the UN Security Council, which we'll definitely talk about a little bit more later. And then we have, so communism was reconceived as an existential risk, especially with the beginning of the Cold War approaching. They saw communism as like a very big risk to the capitalist and consumerist culture that what the US was kind of spreading worldwide, and would soon spread drastically very quickly. When Truman assumed office, he really started pushing forward with machine politics, which led to the rise in the military-industrial complex. And along with the military-industrial complex, we ended up seeing the almost a direct correlation with foreign policy moving out of Congress and into executive bureaucracy. So kind of out of Congress and into the hands of lawyers, bureaucrats, like business leaders, CEOs, etc. And then one of the kind of big reasons we see this shift is because permanent war equals permanent war employment, and war equals money for private companies. So like Lockheed Martin, Blackwater, etc. These kind of weapons manufacturers, they make all this money. And we also kind of see this corporate profit leading to resource grabs to keep the production going, which then leads to more corporate profit. We end up seeing this really big cycle of just complete imperialism. And throughout this process, and especially now, we can really see that the US's foreign policies are not created or designed for the people that they directly affect, or the people that they directly kind of, their impact is seen on, which is really important.
Okay. So again, following World War II, our post-war priorities as a country were like first and foremost, the containment of communism, because the USSR was one of the world's like largest superpowers at the time. There was no way that we were going to go in and destroy the USSR. So our strategy more so was to contain it, to stop the spread of communism and the Soviet influence. So you definitely see this with Soviet-backed Arab nations. We'll talk about this a lot later on. The next is ensuring markets for export. So the US really governs global trade because our Navy is everywhere. We control the world's waters in many ways. And we really went from our main economic resource being what we make and sell and export to more so being about financial servicing and importing because we were really in control of global trade. So our economic growth no longer came from what we create, but more so from controlling these avenues of trade. So this became really important when we talk about the Sinai Peninsula later and the importance of the Middle East and just in general. We have touched on it a couple of times, but the creation of the UN and the use of the Security Council veto. So the UN Security Council has 5 permanent members. That is the US, China, France, Russia, and the UK. And each of these powers has each of these entities has the power to veto any vote. So it doesn't matter what other support there might be. If you vote no, if you vote to veto something, it's officially out, even if you're the only one. We see the US doing this with not 1, not 2, but 3 UN ceasefire resolutions that were brought forward. And this becomes a really strategic tool because you can really change the way that policy is written and the way that these resolutions are written. So you see the US rejecting 3 UN ceasefire resolutions that could have ended the genocide in Gaza immediately, only to try to put forward resolutions that were written by the US that were immediately vetoed by other nations because they so unfairly benefited Israel, for example. So you see throughout history, the US is really flexing our power in the UN as this like Security Council vote to just benefit ourselves and ensure resolutions that benefit Israel as well. Okay, so why is the Middle East important? First and foremost, the Sinai Peninsula and the Suez Canal. So the Sinai Peninsula is a body of land that connects the Asian and African continents. So it's bounded by the Mediterranean Sea to the north and the Red Sea to the south. And it's crucial for global trade because European trade ships, for example, if they are unable to use the Suez Canal, they have to make a trek all the way around the coast of Africa. So that turns a trip that would be 20 to 30 days into just 13 hours. So that becomes important when you're a colonial power or an imperial force so that you can get to where you need to be quickly. You can also take resources and trade, and it just becomes really important for your movements on a global scale. And there have been sort of tensions for the control of the canal since its very early history, much as a result of Egypt's colonial history and foreign superpowers constantly trying to gain control of that passageway. But again, we'll talk about that more later. The next is oil production. So there's a ton of oil in the region. I think we all know this. So 10 of the most oil-rich countries in the Middle East only account for 3.4% of the land mass in the region, but they contain 48% of the world's known oil reserves. So it's just a very oil-rich area, and gaining control over that region would basically lead to you gaining control over the oil industry as a whole, and therefore global trade. Because if you can control oil, you can control the movement of oil and people's ability to trade just in general. I'm going to pass it off to Morgan now.
Yes, so so the nuclear, oh goodness, okay. So nuclear and military strike capacity. So during the Cold War, the US made it a geographical point to have their weapons and missiles be closer to the things they wanted to hit. So it's pretty hard to shoot missiles that far when this was kind of taking place. So the US kind of decided, well, if we can put our missiles in places that are closer, like in Turkey, and then go ahead and do that, then we can hit more targets. We're closer, we have more resources, we have a reason to be there, we have relevance. And And those military bases that we place all over the place, they also don't only contain missiles, but they contain like ammunition storage. They contain just storage in general, like just things that you would need on a military base or things that you think you'd need on a military base. And then the non-aligned movement and Soviet activity in the region. So the non-aligned movement, which I know you were talking a little bit about earlier. So it's a collection of 120 countries. It's not officially aligned with any major power bloc. This movement was founded by the leaders of Egypt, Ghana, India, Indonesia, and Yugoslavia in 1961, with the view of advancing the interests of developing countries and recently decolonized nations in the political climate of the Cold War. So that's why it was originally formed. I'm going to kind of go into a little bit of history in just a second, but it is still an active body. They meet every 3 years. I think the location changes, but they don't have like a constitution or anything. They kind of have rotating people that sort of run it and host it. So it's not like it's formal, but it's not, like I said, it's not like official in the, yes.
Is as official as a non-aligned movement.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So the origins, like I was saying a little bit ago, they actually date back to 1955 and a little bit earlier. But 1955 specifically was a very crucial year in the development of the relations between Arab states and other international, kind of the major world power blocs at the time. So at this time, Egypt specifically was seen as a very formidable Arab power. President Nasser, Nasser, I always stutter, of Egypt was instrumental in the creation of the movement. He and the press pretty much were kind of emphasizing this idea of non-alignment for a little bit. Quite a while. This idea of the non-alignment with either world power bloc being the most suitable kind of choice for Arab nationalism ended up becoming a pretty popular opinion in the area, in the region. During this, Egypt's relations with the West were very steadily deteriorating, while at the same time, the Soviet Union was starting to establish really close political and economic ties with Egypt specifically. This kind of comes from the Soviet Union helped Egypt kind of end their dependence on the West for military support, military aid. After 1955, Israel attacked Gaza, which was then occupied by Egypt. This exposed a lot of flaws in their Egypt's armed forces. They ended up going to the U.S. for aid. The U.S. gave them some like crap deal, and they were like, absolutely not. So they ended up going to Soviet Union. By September that year, they ended up what was called the Egyptian Czech arms deal. So that ended up being placed forward. And then also we kind of see Egypt adapting socialism in their domestic affairs. Oh, goodness. Adapting socialism in their domestic affairs and non-alignment in their international affairs. And these decisions were also being enacted at the same time by other major world leaders of the Afro-Asian world. And all this kind of wraps up as the US pretty much saw the non-aligned movement as a and especially its ties to the Soviet Union, as indirectly as they are, even though the whole point of the non-aligned movement was to not have ties with any major power bloc. But the US basically saw this movement as a challenge to its ability to affect and control trade in the region, but also to affect and control the region itself. They viewed the movement as potentially dangerous alignment of Egypt and other Arab states, kind of in alignment with the Soviet bloc. Again, that's not what it was, but that's the way that the US perceived it. So,
right. So the next question is, why would the US choose Israel as an ally? So there are a lot of reasons. They're based on cultural, racial, logistical, and some religious components. First and foremost, in the post-World War II era, during the Cold War, we were very against communism. We were trying to fight it in every way possible. We still are. And Israel is seen as the only true democracy in the region. So that sort of put them in our favor immediately. The second is because the US is a nation where our constitution and laws are written to promote white supremacist ideals and subjugate anyone else who falls out of that category. So it's not a mistake that most Israelis are of white European descent. So it makes sense that the US would choose the only predominantly racially white and ethnically European entity in the Middle East as its ally. Another reason is Israel is geographically isolated, and it's always at odds with its neighboring Arab nations. So there are a lot of tensions, right? And there's a lot of violence that happens. And this dates back to the formation of Israel, because this is where it all started. Israel created huge disruptions. The Nakba, they displaced people, they murdered people. There were wars, massacres in the region, not just in Palestine, but also in Lebanon and in Syria, Jordan. Like it created so much disruption in the region that everyone hates Israel in the recent region for a reason. And they really needed an ally as much as the US needed an entity to protect their interests in the region. And then I would say like another reason is there's overwhelming support from evangelical Christians for Israel. And 25% of the US population identifies as evangelical Christian. And this is for a lot of reasons. Part of it stems because the claim to the land of Israel it's a biblical claim. It's a religious claim. And also evangelicals believe that reinstating the state of Israel is essential to bringing about the second coming of Christ. And I don't know why you'd want the world to end, but sure. So in the past, this has meant that there's overwhelming support from the US public, but even with today's genocide, that is dwindling as well, for probably the first time that we're seeing in American history, since the evangelical Christian group has created such a powerful sort of political and voting base.
For what it's worth, I grew up in an evangelical household. Even if I tried to explain it, it's madness, absolute madness. And no, the whole like, why would you want the world to end? It's difficult. It's difficult.
Yeah. Trust me, I'm right there with you. Yeah. I was raised by doomsday preppers, so I'm right there with you. Yeah. We'll have to talk after.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So sorry, thank you. Oh, wait. Oh, we're already on the timeline. Wow. Holy smokes. Okay, so we get to talk about the Suez Canal again. Isn't this fun, guys? Oh, sorry. I forgot about the first point. My bad. So, just in general, there was a rise of domestic Zionism and global anti-communism globally and in the United States after World War II. Of course, there was the Holocaust. Everyone was trying to figure out what does this mean for European Jews who are now displaced. And of course, that means we need to subjugate and kill an entire other population of people, right? Next, we're going to go into the Suez crisis. And I forgot to even preface what this slide was, so I'm sorry. I hope you guys read the headline, but this is a historical timeline of US and Israel relations. I just got so excited about the Suez Canal. So to really understand what happened in the Suez crisis, you have to look back to the creation of the Suez Canal in general. So it was built originally by the French in the late 1800s, and it was then the company that governed the canal was mutually owned by the French and the British, but it was always considered like Egyptian land, quote unquote. But Egypt was a colony of Britain until 1922, so I don't really know what that means. So Egypt eventually acquires independence. They're recognized as being an independent state in 1922, but the UK still has control of their foreign affairs, their communications, basically everything that's important. Eventually, the monarchy is ousted, and then President Nasser comes into power, and he nationalizes the Suez Canal in 1955. And this is huge because it kicks a European power out from controlling that canal. And this was really a move to make Egypt like a powerhouse in the region, to really boost their economy and give them more autonomy and not be owed to these European powers. They also started denying passageway to Israeli ships through the canal. So guess who that made really upset? It was Israel. So then France, Britain, and Israel sort of came up with this plot to attack Egypt and try to take control of the canal again. I'm trying to find the name really quick. Yes, okay, so Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev caught wind of this and threatened to start bombing London, which sort of put nuclear war looming over this entire event, which was really scary for everyone involved and everyone in the world. And this also really blindsided the US because they were unaware of this plot that Germany, France, and Israel were plotting against the Suez Canal in Egypt. So the US threatened sanctions against all of these nations if they did not stop, which eventually Britain and France ceded first, and then eventually Israel. So this sort of shows that Israel is not really for the US, like the US is for Israel. A lot of the time, our support of Israel actually ends up hurting us as a nation. It ends up hurting us as citizens. Eventually, you know, the Suez Canal also marked the USA and the USSR as the true world powers. It kind of knocked France and Britain down a bit. And that's when you really see that dynamic between Western-backed nations and Soviet-backed nations. I guess we can talk about the 6-Day War now.
Yes. So the 6-Day War, I actually don't, it says on the side. War that effectively destroys Egypt's capacity for independent action, and Israel seemingly does this without US assistance. Okay, now I'm going to read the notes I have here for you guys. So the 6-Day War, if you don't know, was a war fought between Israel, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. In the months leading up to this war, tensions in Egypt and Israel's already tumultuous relationship were heightening, and they heightened further until May 1967. Egypt once again denied Israeli vessels passage to the Suez Canal, as we were talking about earlier. And in response, Israel launched a surprise offensive on Egypt's Air Force that caught them completely off guard, ended up giving Israel pretty much supremacy over the airspace during all of the fighting. In the American context, the U.S. kind of narrated this as a necessary preemptive strike against Israel by Egypt, or against Egypt by Israel. And their excuse was that Egypt was preparing to attack Israel, so they had to shoot first, right? So Jordan and Syria then mobilized to defend Egypt, but they were largely beaten back by Israel. We then get the U.S. stepping in to impose peace on the region because the U.S. does that. They like to do that, stepping in. And this also kind of demonstrates that they can, in fact, do that. They can step into situations when they get out of hand, and they can put a halt to them. So by the time Egypt and Jordan had agreed to a ceasefire, Israel had seized Syria's Golan Heights, the Jordanian annexed West Bank, which included East Jerusalem, and Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, as well as the Egyptian-occupied Gaza Strip. So this offensive pretty much demonstrated that Israel is a completely isolated entity in the region, but that they can fight and they're willing to fight, and that makes them kind of a bigger ally to the U.S. Before the 6-Day War, like we had kind of said, Egypt was a formidable Arab power, and then after this, that power was pretty much gone. Like they really didn't have much after that. Something that people sometimes kind of don't know or sort of forget is that during this time, Israel actually sunk one of the U.S.'s naval ships, the USS Liberty. This was sunk by Israel because it was spying on communications in the region. Israel basically didn't want the U.S. to know that they were doing really shady shit. So they bombed this, just completely sunk this ship, which killed 36 U.S. sailors, wounded 171. The U.S. pretty much just blanket accepted the explanation that Israel gave them of mistaken identity. They said they thought it was an Egyptian vessel. That being said, U.S. state security officials, who were the ones that intercepted the transcripts from the Israeli radio communications, they challenged this narrative completely. But that being said, there still was very little investigation on the U.S.'s end, which kind of shows that all of our military investments, they're not meant to support U.S. civilians or service members. They're meant to support the agenda of the people in charge and the money. Yes, exactly. They're meant to support the money.
And I think also, before you move on, I just want to say also that this is another example of Israel not being the US's friend, but the US just continues to back Israel no matter what, and then deny every time Israel does something against either us as a country, us as citizens, or our service members. Sorry.
No, you're good. That's exactly. Yes. So then we have kind of throughout this, starting in sort of the 1960s throughout the 1980s, we see Israel fighting on behalf of the US's anti-communist, their efforts as well as their own. this basically is showing that Israel is demonstrably serving US interests when it suits them. Some examples of what they did during this time, Israel intervened in the Jordanian civil war. This is known as Black September. They aided the Kurds in Iraq on behalf of the US, despite the US official proclamation of support of Iraq during the war. And they also performed other acts of support for the US. They promote their interests, as well as keeping American hands clean. And kind of furthering this keeping American hands clean, throughout the 80s and into the present day, we see this kind of bizarre, not really bizarre when you think about it, but this extreme connection between the CIA and Mossad, the intelligence agency of Israel. So they've exchanged classified data since the early 50s, stuff about on like Soviet espionage activities, specifics on the Arab states kind of surrounding Israel in the region, other matters of kind of mutual concern in quotations. Also, Israel allows the US to torture people on their land, and the US allows Mossad to do things like infiltrate college encampments. So that happens. Yep.
Are you guys doing okay? I know that this is like a lot of information. Everyone good? Okay, cool. In 1982, Israel dislodges the PLO from Lebanon. So the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, had been based in southern Lebanon from the 1960s to 1982 when this event occurs. So it was growing as an organization, really gathering support in the region and continuing their armed struggle with Israel, all for the fight for Palestinian liberation. So Israel invaded Lebanon and eventually pushed the PLO north, but that wasn't good enough to just get them away from the northern border with Israel. They wanted to completely expel them from Lebanon as a whole. So that's when they laid siege to Beirut. So they blocked access to water, food, every basic humanitarian right, kind of like what they're doing in Gaza right now, for 2 months, which led to the starvation and death of like countless civilians. And eventually it did lead to the expulsion of the PLO from Lebanon. And during this time, the US was more invested in peace talks and sent emissary Philip Habib to work on peace negotiations. But despite an interest in peace on the surface, the US did use their UN Security Council vote to veto a peace resolution that would have demanded an immediate withdrawal of Israeli forces from Beirut. And the reason is because it was the US reason for vetoing this resolution was because it was a quote unquote transparent attempt to preserve the PLO as a viable political force. So that's when you very explicitly see the US using their veto vote to then try to negotiate a deal that would be better for Israel in the long run, because they didn't want any sort of Palestinian organization or liberation group to have a seat at the table, to have any sort of official political recognition. So then when we get into the mid-90s, we get into the Oslo Accords, which were a pair of interim quote unquote peace agreements between the PLO and Israel that were signed in the mid-1990s. It was in 1993 and 1995. They were negotiated mainly between Yasser Arafat, who was the PLO chairman, and Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. The moderating began in Oslo, in the Netherlands, because they were considered an impartial party, because they didn't have strong affiliations with either the Palestinian leadership or with Israel. So they were seen as a good entity. But then the US somehow, gets involved and begins negotiating as well. So I would like to say that these agreements are really problematic because they were negotiated completely in secret. They were done without the consideration or consent of Palestinians or other Arab civilians. And this really hurt Yasser Arafat's credibility with Palestinians. He was seen as a traitor. There are some dissenting views and people feel differently because of some things that Morgan will talk about after I'm done. But overall, this was seen as like the biggest loss for the Palestinian people since like the Nakba and the Naksa. And also, this wasn't good for Rabin either, because he was actually assassinated for participating in these negotiations. So that just shows you this sort of like very right turn that the Israeli populace was taking, that a citizen assassinated the prime minister for even participating in negotiations with Palestinians. Do you have a question?
Like, yeah.
It was an Israeli citizen
So
that
it was
assassinated.
similar, right? Like a hardliner settlers.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry. When I mean citizen, maybe it wasn't like an Israeli citizen, but it wasn't like a political figure. It was just like some guy. Yeah.
So that you said that influenced like the right, the zoom to the right, essentially among like Israeli nationals.
I don't know if it in sort of if it affected it, but I think it illustrates it more so. Let me put it that way. I think that it illustrates that, you know, just even having a prime minister that sat down at the table to negotiate with a Palestinian power was seen as egregious and treacherous and traitorous, you know?
I think also like this part was supposed to, in theory, put a stop to settlements. I know definitely in Gaza, but I think also in the West Bank it was supposed to see how that's going.
Yeah.
But like, you know, these the hardline settlers we see, especially in the West Bank, they want no quarter. They want it all. They
Mhm.
want it all. They want the greater Israel, and Oslo was seen as like a threat to that. And yeah, hopefully possible.
Yeah, and whether or not they even knew what was in the peace agreement because it was so secretive when it was being negotiated. Yeah, it was just hugely unpopular. Yes, Brendan.
Yeah, I just wanted to also point out, like Yitzhak Rabin, he sort of seems like a martyr for liberal Zionism in Israel, which that's a contradiction term, but moving beyond that, he was sort of seen as like the last quote unquote left wing Zionist.
Mhm.
Like so among quote unquote liberal Zionists in Israel, he's a martyr. He's sort of like, you know, his like death date is more because so yeah, a lot of his many liberal Israelis do not like the right return in after that.
So definitely marks a shift. The assassination. Yeah.
Not that it really makes a difference.
No.
Okay. Okay, so now I'm going to kind of talk about the sort of the details of the Oslo Agreement and kind of why it sucked so much. So for starters, this did not change, like nothing changed. Like the fact Israel would never recognize the right for Palestinian statehood, that did not change. Israel would never recognize the right of return for any expelled Palestinian or their descendants. Israel would never recognize Jerusalem as Palestinian territory, yet the Oslo Accords gave recognition of Israel as a state. So basically what happened was Israel agreed to promise a future, they literally promised, like a pinky swear basically. They promised a future state to Palestinians, which under the 67 West Bank borders in Gaza, and that Palestinians could have complete control over these areas. But the control they were given was to monitor and report things like births and deaths, population counts, and other things that just like having control over doesn't really serve a purpose in the long run. Like it does, but not in terms of like becoming your own actual state. Additionally, areas that were considered under Palestinian control in the West Bank ended up being separated into 3 areas, areas A, B, and C. Area A was 22% of the West Bank was under the newly Palestinian control. Area B, that's 18% of the West Bank, was under joint control. And Area C, 60% of the West Bank, this was under full Israeli control. Also in, let me actually backtrack a little bit. Sorry, there's a lot of notes. If these accords sucked, there's a lot of notes on these.
They were problematic in a lot of
They were
ways,
terrible, like they were awful. So each of these areas were geographically isolated from each other. Palestinian roads connecting the areas have either been completely destroyed, they've been cut off, or they're subject to numerous checkpoints. I forget exactly how many checkpoints said we're in, but I mean, there's like hundreds of checkpoints. This makes travel between the areas very lengthy, dangerous, and almost impossible. It's also important to note in 1995, Israel built an electronic fence and a concrete wall surrounding the Gaza Strip, which completely snapped interactions between the split Palestinian territories. And then
can I just say one thing really quick? Yeah. So when you have different areas that are geographically isolated from each other, you can't really refer to that as a nation, right? Because you have area A, B, and C, and then the Gaza Strip all not having access to each other, essentially. Like you can't govern that as a nation. There's no way to do that. Sorry.
So that, oh, yeah.
You said it was section C that was under Israeli control.
Mhm.
Was that taken under, like, was it seized at any, or is it still, like, how is that section, just in general? Like, who owns it now, or did the Israelis seize that section?
I
Well,
mean,
even if it's under like, even if there are
Palestinian
Palestinians who live there, it's still like subject to like illegal settlement, essentially. So I don't know if we have like a great answer or a very specific answer to that now, but areas A, B, and C are still being infringed upon like to this day because of illegal Israeli settlements. Yeah.
Another
Well,
thing.
Yeah.
So another thing, Gaza was originally meant to be controlled by the newly formed Palestinian Authority, the PA. This was supposed to remember, this was meant to be an interim agreement. This was not meant to be longstanding and was not meant to be permanent at all. So the newly formed PA was supposed to make way for the first official elected Palestinian government, which would then run the independent state in the West Bank and Gaza with their capital in East Jerusalem. That never happened. So Israel ended up gaining more control instead of less. They never gave Palestinians anything. Oh my gosh, they never gave Palestinians anything. Only a promise that they would give them those things in time if Palestinian leadership recognized the state of Israel. So they went ahead and did that. It didn't really work out the way that they believed it would. It gave the rest of the world the green light to pretty much do the same and also accept the state of Israel. And then after Oslo, the Palestinians were not allowed to riot. They weren't allowed to resist the Israeli occupation. Fatah, the PLO leadership, became to many Palestinians an equal enemy. That suppresses and arrests Palestinians who were not, quote, peaceful. So basically Palestinians that weren't accepting of Israel's recognition, weren't accepting of the expansion of its occupation, weren't accepting at the Palestinian leadership and their corruption at the time. And then when Yasser Arafat saw that the Oslo Accords were not actually helping Palestinians, it was only worsening the situation and giving Israel more power. He tried to pull out and push for Israel to grant the Palestinian right of return, as well as give Palestinians recognition of statehood and Al-Quds as their capital. As a result of this push for his people, he did gain back some support, and then he was ultimately killed by Israel. Kind of summing all of this up, as Bonnie said earlier, the Oslo Accords are considered both another NAPCA and another NECPA and another NEXA, because the Palestinians lost recognition of statehood at the expense of giving Israel that exact same recognition. The Israeli occupation strengthened and expanded, and it's continuing to do so today. I mean, we see that, like, there was a convention in like December, January, February of Israeli real estate companies coming over trying to sell beachfront properties in Gaza. So we definitely still see that happening, and it's ridiculous. Also, the Oslo Accords created divides and distrust within the Palestinian community itself, and resulted in riots, protests, and essentially the split of Palestine and Palestinians into different factions.
And I know that you said this earlier, but I just want to like reiterate that the Oslo Accords, when we say it's an interim peace agreement from the mid-90s, it was always meant to be temporary. It was supposed to be a bridge to a permanent peace agreement that the US never pushed to actually get there. It was never pushed to actually be negotiated. And you see that now with ceasefire resolutions that are going around where, you know, we're looking for a permanent and immediate ceasefire resolution, but what Israel wants is a temporary ceasefire resolution that will, quote unquote, I'm saying quote unquote for everyone on Zoom all the time, but that will quote unquote lead to a permanent ceasefire or a permanent negotiation, but there's never a pathway to get there. Nobody ever pushes for it. So it just seems like an interim to sort of like stop it now so that we can just do it again later. We being Israel, but yeah. So then coming out of the Oslo Accords, one of the next big things that really affects the US's relationship with Israel in the region is 9/11. So when it was found out that some of the perpetrators of 9/11 were Saudi Arabian, that really changed our relationship with the region, because we did have an agreement, the 1951 Mutual Defense Agreement with Saudi Arabia, that really made us allied with them. But then when we found out that some of the perpetrators of 9/11 were Saudi, we no longer had that trust in the nation. So we really began to rely on Israel to gain intel and protect our interests in the region, because we had that like 20-year-long war that resulted from 9/11. So it was necessary. It wasn't. The war wasn't necessary, but our feeling of needing that intel was, let me just say.
So now we're going to talk a little bit, we kind of already talked about the majority of this stuff, but this is just to kind of specify some specific spots where the US did influence the Palestine question. I'm going to say that in quotes, Palestine question. So in 1948, the partition of Israel and Palestine, so many UN nations were very hesitant to officially recognize Israel as a state, but the US and Soviet Russia, I think that's pretty important to recognize the fact that they did this together. Like, they were both lobbying to gather more votes for Israel to become an actual state for people to recognize them. We also have US support for Israel's occupation of Gaza and the West Bank. Like I was talking about earlier, it's still very much ongoing. The US did not enforce the UN sanctioned partition of the land in the '67 war, and both supported and continues to support further settlement and occupation of Palestinian land in Gaza and the West Bank. The military and financial support for Israel. So this is like I hate this fact so much. It just burns my soul. But since 1948, the US has sent over $300 billion in economic and military aid to Israel, which is nearly twice as much aid as we've sent to any other country. Like, we've sent almost twice as much aid to Israel than any other place we've ever sent aid.
And it could have ended homelessness in this country countless times over. It could have ended world hunger, most likely.
Mm-hmm. And we'll talk a little bit more about this stuff in a little bit. And then the Oslo Peace Accords and process, this could have really been a turning point for Palestinian autonomy as a nation. But the US botched the agreements and allowed for a loosely worded accord which favored Israeli interests. They basically just allowed that to be signed. So here's a couple moments when things could have gone differently. I have to get a little bit closer to read this off the slide. So in 1947, the US could have influenced the partition plan of Israel. In 1957, the Suez Crisis did not have to transform US foreign policy. In 1967, the US could have enforced the previous borders and not allowed them to be redrawn. In 1973, we had the Egyptian-Israel War. So it was a war that ended with Israel regaining lost ground and the recognition of the Suez Canal as an international waterway, which ended Egypt's blockade on the canal since 1967. And during this time, the US could have allowed for Egypt to negotiate a different peace that would not have kind of resulted in that. And then we have in 1993, the US could have negotiated the Oslo Accords in good faith and not just pretty much completely for the side of Israel. And then 2023 to present, at any given moment in time, the US has the complete ability to stop sending aid, stop sending weapons, pick up the phone and say, stop doing this. And they have that opportunity. Yeah, and sanctions, and they just have not done that yet. And they have not. Yeah, exactly.
It's also bad for business.
Exactly.
Okay. Oh, this is my slide, sorry. Yeah, so as we said earlier, Israel is the largest recipient of US aid, largely, more than double any other nation that we've given aid to over time, from 1946 to 2024. Again, it's over $300 billion. So this is we send an incredible amount of US military aid to Israel. So these numbers that you see on the screen are from February. So we're 4 months past this now. Like, it's likely like increased an incredible amount. And I just want to note too the hypocrisy of us sending this military aid. We're sending bombs to kill people, but we are also supplying aid to try to feed those people at the same time, but in the most ineffective ways. So we're sending what is essentially billions of dollars of weapons to Israel. but we are using aid drops that have faulty parachutes that are falling on people and killing them. We are building this pier that's supposed to supply aid to Palestinians that was then used to launch an attack on a refugee camp that might have gotten 4 Israeli captives, but killed 270 Palestinians and wounded over 700 refugees. So again, we're sending bombs to kill the people that we're also supplying aid to, in quotation marks. So you were talking about sanctions just a moment ago. So this is just like a quick diagram for explaining how we can enforce our red lines. So you hear Biden say that like Rafa's a red line. He keeps talking about his red lines, and then the red line gets crossed and he doesn't do anything. So these are just 7 things that we can do immediately to that could stop this right off the bat. So first and foremost, direct aid. We send direct aid everywhere, and as we just established, primarily to Israel. We could stop that direct aid immediately. We sell weapons to everyone. We could stop selling weapons to Israel. We can enforce sanctions. We can block the trades and payments of to Israel. We can also use our dominance in global trade to block SWIFT payments and use of the euro dollar to make trades. We can cripple Israel in their ability to trade. This is a thing you're going to see over and over again, because the next one is that we control the world's oceans because our Navy is everywhere. We can block Israeli ships from moving. We can stop the movement of supplies. We can cripple them economically. The next you see is the military power, or the big stick. Nobody likes war. Nobody wants war to happen. But if everything else fails, we can use our military force against Israel to make it stop, to end the genocide in Gaza. And 7, we have de facto control of the UN, as we've established with the Security Council veto vote, which we have been continually using to support Israel and hurt Palestinians. Yeah.
So just to kind of like wrap up everything that we sort of talked about, and to kind of go back to that question that we sort of spoke about in the beginning that Bonnie mentioned, of like when people ask, well, why should I care? Like, this doesn't involve me. This actually impacts us directly, very, very much. Like we just got done talking about, billions of dollars are sent to Israel. Those billions of dollars come from our taxes. Like the money that you go and work your ass off to pay your bills, to feed your family, to put a roof over your head, and you pay those taxes are going to Israel to fund the wars. It's not a war, it's a genocide, let's be real. To fund the genocide, murdering Palestinian men, women, children, babies, and also fund those, our taxes, they're not funding our own rights. Like we don't have universal health care, we don't have good public transportation, we don't have maternity leave, paternity leave, we don't have any of that stuff. But you know who does? Israelis. And you know how they have them? From our tax dollars. So they don't do that stuff for us, but they do it for Israelis. So that definitely impacts us. The unwavering support from US leaders, I mean, it's been, 9 months? I don't even, time is just not a thing to me anymore, but we've been out in the streets for how long now? And the unwavering support that just has barely shifted from our, the people that run our country.
Those red lines don't matter.
Yeah, those red lines don't matter. Biden bypassing Congress to send more weapons to Israel, which he's done multiple times. I think it was May 24th, I think might have been one of the most recent times he's done it. I honestly lose track because it happens so often, I feel like. Zionist lobbying groups such as AIPAC. So these lobbying groups run our country. They have our politicians in their pocket. They give them buttloads of money to basically vote the way they want them to.
At our detriment.
At
as
our detriment,
US citizens.
Yeah. They give money to corporations to keep these corporations in their pocket as well. So these lobbying groups they affect us in ways that we may not even realize. The IDF and US police connections. So if you don't, I'm assuming everybody has, or hopefully heard of the cop cities that are going up around the nation, where the IDF will either come over here and train our police, or we send our police over to Israel, where the IDF will train, or the IOF, will train our police in their tactics of urban warfare and how they subjugate Palestinians. They train our police in that so they can come over here and do that to all of us, specifically right now targeting Black and brown folk, but eventually kind of like we're all going to be affected. It's
The,
not
the tactic that the
Yeah.
cop used to kill
George Floyd.
George Floyd
Was
was developed by
in
the IOF. Yeah.
Yes. And also very important, especially locally, when people say, how does this impact us? There's a cop city right now being built like 20 minutes away in Hershey. Yeah. It broke ground in December. It's very big, very expensive. I think it's like 12 or 13 $million. Very expensive. It's also coincidentally at the top of a hill. If you know much about Israeli settlements, they're typically at the top of a hill. So is this cop city, which I just kind of put two and two together a
Ominous.
couple weeks ago, that it's at the high, on top of the highest hill in Hershey, which is very, very ominous, like you said. And then lastly, the US voting against ceasefires or using vetoes every time in the UN. Yesterday was what, the maybe second time they didn't use a veto because they brought something to the table. Yeah, so that also impacts us a lot. Yeah. And then we're gonna end on this.
Oh,
Quote
yeah. So,
here.
so this is a quote from Joe Biden from 2013. An independent Israel secure in its own borders, recognized by the world in the practical strategic interest of the United States of America. He said he used to say, if there were no Israel, we have to invent one. And this phrase that he used he first said in 1986. And this quote really just makes clear that US relations with Israel has nothing to do with there needing to be a safe homeland for the global Jewish population, which I feel like is what people always go back to. It's like, well, what's going to happen to the Jews? But it has everything to do with our political, economic, and imperial interests in the region and across the world. And, you know, when Joe Biden says, if there were no Israel, we'd have to invent one. When we are the first nation to recognize the independent state of Israel, I think 11 minutes after the UN did, it's almost like we helped invent Israel. And then, so we talked a lot about American foreign policy today, and these are some helpful books where some of this information was gleaned from. So this is a helpful reading list if anyone would like to take a picture or anything, if you're interested in any of the books.
I do also want to add a lot of the stuff that we talked about in the timeline and in general, the 100 Years War on Palestine by Rashid Khalidi. This is a really, really good book for especially that timeline slide we went over from the Palestinian perspective. So I highly, highly, highly please recommend reading this book. Before we even approached this teach-in, I knew I felt comfortable giving it because I had read this book. Like it's very informative, and it's definitely, if you are still a little bit unsure on your knowledge or your understanding, I'd highly recommend reading this book.
Speaking of books,
Yes, speaking of books.
Amy, do you want to come talk about books? Wait, let me give you a microphone.
So those of you that were here at the last one, you put them. No, sorry. No. So I actually have the books, and Bonnie designed this very cute sticker. So we're asking, these teach-ins are labors of love. The slideshow, the Bonnie and Morgan's like learning, this all is very valuable. And so one way that we are trying to give back to our local community is if you are able to make a $5 to $10 donation or more to the HPC Venmo, and then you can put your first name on this sticker and we will stick it in this book. This is We Are Palestinians. We're going to get a shipment of 100 Zayn and Nima stand for Palestine. They haven't arrived yet, but we have these bad boys. And then these books that have been sponsored will be given to Layers of Black History, which is a local organization that distributes books at different fairs, schools. They have some activities this summer, and so we're hoping to help diversify their collection with some children's books about Palestine. So as you're leaving, if you're able to do this, please stop by and see me, and we'll have you fill out a sticker to put in a book, and then it will go to Layers of Black History. So yeah, thanks so much for coming to this.
No, that's it.
Yeah. Thank you very much.